Hello everyone, welcome to the launch of Biocultural Heritage in the UK. I'm Chris Dalgleish, I'm a director of Inherit, and it's my pleasure to introduce the event today and to guide us through the proceedings. I'd just like to begin with a few words about why this topic's of interest to us at Inherit. Inherit is part of a heritage charity here in the UK called the York Archaeological Trust. And the mission of the Trust is building better lives through heritage. The Trust's been doing that for almost 50 years now, initially in York and then over time elsewhere in the UK as well, and indeed internationally. Inherit, which is the short name for the Institute for Heritage and Sustainable Human Development, is a relatively new part of the Trust story. We were established in 2017. Really to help the Trust expand its capabilities for delivering that mission. And our work at Inherit is about supporting people to use their cultural heritage to address humanitarian and environmental problems, really. To put that another way, it's about supporting people to use their heritage to improve their lives and the places they live. It's also not just about supporting people at the community level to use their heritage in those ways, but it's about helping to bring about that change in the wider environment, whether that's in policy, the law, in practice, to enable people to use their heritage, to sustain their heritage and to use it for the benefit of themselves and their communities. We do this in three main ways through Inherit. Firstly, through purposeful research, and we're here to talk about a research report today. Secondly, by advocating evidence-based change in policy and practice. And thirdly, by working in practice with communities ourselves and with other NGOs, public bodies and partners in different places. We work here in the UK where we're based, but we also work internationally, and currently that's in a number of other countries in Europe, in the Middle East and further east in Asia as well, always in collaboration, as I say, with other organisations and with communities. Given all of this, we were delighted when Zoe Russell, who we'll be hearing from soon, approached us with the idea of doing a research internship with Inherit on this topic of biocultural heritage, which fits really well with our interest in cultural heritage, how it can support human development and environmental sustainability. It also fits very well with another aspect of what we see as core to what we do, which is the exchange of knowledge around the world, learning from what people are doing elsewhere, and trying to adapt that, build on it, build from it in the context that we work in. And I think that's sort of central to what Zoe's been doing through the research. I'll introduce Zoe in a second. Before I do that, I just wanted to run through some practicalities for the event. The report was published earlier today on our website. I placed a link to that in the chat, so you can find it through that. You should have received an email as well with details of that. I'd like to remind you that we're recording the event so that we can share it on our website afterwards for those who couldn't make it today. So please just bear that in mind when contributing to the chat and so on. Please use the chat function throughout the event. I see many of you are already doing that to let us know who you are and where you are and what's happening. Please place comments in the chat and put questions there for Zoe and for the panel for later on in the final section of the event. I'll take some of those questions and put them to the panel and to Zoe for discussion. You'll no doubt be familiar with Zoom, but if you're not, in the top right corner of your screen, there's a view button, and you may want to make sure that you switch the viewing option to speaker rather than gallery. That means you'll get a larger screen with whoever's speaking at the time. So all that remains is for me to introduce Zoe to kick us off with a presentation of the findings of the report. Zoe Russell is a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Stirling, based both in the Faculty of Social Sciences and in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and I think that combination comes through in her work. Her PhD research focuses on communities, sustainability and heritage in the context of the West of Ross UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in Scotland. She took 3 months out of that PhD research earlier this year to join us for a research internship, which was funded by the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science. And I'd just like to say thank you at this point to the Graduate School for that funding, which enabled Zoe to come and work with us. it was great for us to have the chance to work with Zoe, and I hope she would say the same the other way around. During a time with us, Zoe undertook this research into the potential of biocultural heritage as a concept and a framework for application in different contexts in the UK. And it's that research that we're now going to hear something about. So over to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much for that introduction. That's great. Hopefully you can all see the slides that I've just shared. Just to reiterate, as Chris said, big thank you to the Scottish Graduate School for actually funding me to undertake this internship, and to Chris and colleagues at Inherit for hosting me. It certainly was a really valuable experience, and I would recommend it to anyone. So the aim of the research, as Chris I think said, was to assess the potential value of the biocultural heritage framework in a UK setting. So biocultural heritage, or BCH, as I'll call it, just to avoid repeating biocultural heritage 100 times, BCH challenges the contemporary and historic marginalisation of communities in a nature conservation context, and it prioritises community and collective rights to land and livelihoods, especially in Indigenous contexts. So the concept of collective biocultural heritage was defined in the early 2000s by the International Institute for Environment and Development in collaboration with Association Andes and Quechua communities in Peru. So as they state here, biocultural heritage is the knowledge, innovations and practices of Indigenous peoples and local communities, which are often held collectively and inextricably linked to the traditional resources and territories, including the diversity of genes, varieties, species and ecosystems, cultural and spiritual values and customary laws, which are shaped within the socio-ecological context of communities. So these components of knowledge systems and their ongoing interaction are vital to the use, creation and transmission of traditional knowledge, and linked to the knowledge of cosmic forces, which is part of Indigenous peoples' cosmovision or holistic worldview. So BCH is used in research and practice in a variety of different contexts globally. However, these are predominantly outside of the UK. Scholarship on BCH, however, argues that we need to extend considerations of biocultural heritage to all human societies, and that it's key to more holistic approaches to conservation, landscape, heritage and development. It's suggested that biocultural heritage should be a sustainable development goal in itself, as none of the current goals fully capture the interconnection of nature and culture. So the starting point for the research was the BCH framework developed by the IIED. Embodying their definition of collective biocultural heritage, the framework identifies 5 different elements which combine to create the conditions for resilient livelihoods. So these are biodiversity, landscape, cultural and spiritual values, traditional knowledge and customary laws. Each of these is discussed in detail in the research report, drawing on some of the key arguments in the international literature on BCH. For example, regarding biodiversity, it's argued that conservation must recognise the interlinkage with people's livelihoods and the need for food security. Hence, agricultural biodiversity is seen as crucial to cultivating ecological resilience. So in practice, biocultural heritage territories, such as those in Peru, offer a community-led approach, which can be more effective, fairer and lower cost compared with protected areas. They arise from Indigenous traditions of landscape management, expressed in holistic territorial concepts, and can be described as bottom-up, food-centred processes, which also conserve rich wildlife and ecosystem services. Hence, biodiversity goals are fused with social and economic goals founded on self-determination. Regarding customary laws, these sustain traditional knowledge and genetic resources for use by communities, supporting ecological sustainability and social equity, as well as serving the common good. Hence, biocultural heritage is about recognising collective rather than individual rights, set within a heritage framework rather than one based on private property. Customary laws are key to endogenous development and Indigenous self-determination. So you can read more about these in the report, but a key thing to really recognise is that each of these elements alone recognises the symbiotic relationship between people and their local environments, but it is by considering these things together and recognising their interdependencies, which helps to integrate action for biodiversity with action for cultural heritage, human well-being and prosperity, and the protection and fulfilment of human rights. So In the research, I used this framework as a way to explore existing policies in the UK, predominantly focusing on nature conservation and historic environment sectors, which are most directly related to BCH. I completed a documentary analysis and interviewed individuals from the main UK public bodies, so Nature Scot, Historic Environment Scotland, Historic England, Natural England, CADU, and the Northern Irish Department for Communities. I also worked on 4 case studies to consider the potential value of biocultural heritage in practice. These were as shown on the map, located in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. The English case study looked at a project with 2 UNESCO biospheres, which was called Biocultural Heritage Tourism. This was the only case study explicitly using the terminology of biocultural heritage. The Welsh case study looked at a UNESCO biosphere project called Mixed Farming, Histories and Futures, the principles of which seemed to me to speak to ideas of biocultural heritage. The Northern Ireland case study was about the Mourne Mountains Landscape Partnership and the Mourne Heritage Trust, which again had activities which aligned well with biocultural heritage, for example, mixing cultural heritage with landscape conservation. Finally, the Scotland case study was set in another UNESCO biosphere in Wester Ross, but also considered the surrounding seascape, which takes in some of the marine protected areas. The focus here wasn't on one specific project, but generally marine conservation and heritage. So together, these cases show the diverse applicability of the concept of biocultural heritage in urban, rural and coastal environments in the UK. 3 of the 4 are set within UNESCO biospheres because these are sites based on principles which in theory align very well with biocultural heritage. So the report goes into detail about how each of the elements of biocultural heritage resonate in UK policy. The research suggests that all elements have some recognition. In some cases, like biodiversity and landscape, there's a more or less direct match between the language and thinking of the framework as found in the UK. In other cases, such as with cultural and spiritual values or traditional knowledge and customary laws, we have analogous concepts in the UK, but there's also some differences in the language used and the circumstances being described. So given this, the IIED framework needs some adaptation, and a revised model of BCH is proposed for the UK here. But this aims to really retain the intention, structure and elements of the original model. So the model highlights a range of components that together form an integrated biocultural heritage whole. So we have biodiversity, landscape and seascape, local knowledge, cultural, social and economic values and participatory governance. Local knowledge is used instead of traditional knowledge because of the perception that the latter means knowledge held by only a minority of traditional practitioners, communities or social groups, and which is somehow a relic of the past. So reframing this as local knowledge opens up conversations about the diverse types of knowledge that are found within local communities and transmitted from one generation to the next. Customary laws is reframed here to participatory governance to recognise that whilst some circumstances, such as long-standing commons in the UK, do exist, there are a variety of other and new forms of community governance to consider. The core outcome of resilient livelihoods is expanded to include well-being, which is a prominent concern in UK policy, but which is also central to the original model. For example, it's stated that the main goal of a biocultural heritage territory is not nature conservation, but holistic well-being for people and nature. Supporting this overall outcome requires that all of the components are given due attention and that their interconnection and interdependencies are recognised. So while different elements of this framework are certainly evident in existing policies within the UK, there are some significant gaps and shortcomings to be addressed. So in terms of the practice case studies, each of these was then analysed against the revised BCH framework. So we have biodiversity, landscape, seascape, local knowledge, and diverse cultural and social values being prominent in all of the case studies. However, in all of the case studies, participatory governance was less prominent, both as a feature of conservation governance, but also as an explicit objective for change. However, in the Welsh, Northern Irish and Scottish cases in particular, issues around the agency of communities, participation and governance of land and sea were recognised as key factors. For example, in the Welsh and Northern Irish context, land ownership and land rights were intimately connected to understandings of cultural heritage and attitudes to land uses today. In these and also the Scottish case, it was clear that the ability of communities to self-determine their own prospects around fishing and agriculture, for example, are constrained by wider economic values, which were encouraging unsustainable practices and seeing land viewed as a commodity rather than, say, for its biodiversity or heritage values, or for the ability to generate local self-sufficiency. In the Scottish case, there's an absence of effective mechanisms to govern the sea as a commons resource to create resilient livelihoods and account for diverse cultural and social values. In Wales, a follow-on biosphere project does include plans around leasing land to establish a community-led agricultural enterprise. So the situation regarding participatory governance in these 4 cases speaks to the patchy nature of established forms of these such governance in the UK. Further discussion of the cases is of course available in the full report. So based on the findings from both the policy and the practice aspects, some key points of conclusion can be drawn. Firstly, BCH could be thought of as a sensitising concept, which helps to ensure that policies, decisions and actions around biodiversity take full and proper account of local social, cultural, environmental and economic circumstances, and that they involve rather than exclude the range of people who are affected. So the framework can be seen as a tool for dialogue and a lens through which to analyse what's going on in policy and practice, particularly in terms of the extent to which policy and practice are addressing those links between biodiversity, cultural heritage and people's livelihoods and well-being. So the policy review and the case studies show that attention is increasingly being paid to these links in the UK, however they often remain lesser priorities and are still not being addressed at all in some contexts. This initial research indicates how the framework could be used to identify priorities for action in order to change this. However, it does not prescribe a particular path to be followed regardless of the circumstances, and the value of BCH lies in recognising ignored or discarded knowledges and values so that these can be incorporated into policies, decisions and actions which affect the local environment and communities. Its value also lies in recognising that participatory forms of governance are needed in order for these knowledges and values to be identified, understood and integrated into conservation policies and practices. So BCH needs to be applied flexibly if it's to have meaning in these diverse circumstances and if it's to be empowering and inclusive. The figure here indicates the spectrum of diverse ways in which BCH might be understood in the UK. These are not mutually exclusive categories, but they range from forms of lost practice that can inspire and inform future action, to the creation of new practices to enable biodiversity and community resilience, and thus which could constitute BCH over time when passed on to new generations. One reason why BCH is significant for sustainable development is that the practices, knowledges and values and governance structures to which it refers have been adapted to local circumstances over time. So it's this adaptation, transmission and resilience over time and the co-evolution of people and local environment that it represents, which the term heritage here captures. So it's important to recognise that using this heritage lens to look at current circumstances also helps to understand how the unsustainable aspects of the ways in which we currently own, govern, access and use land and sea have come about. So it can also highlight what kinds of change might therefore be needed and what kind of action might be appropriate in particular places to deliver sustainable development which meets the needs of people and nature both now and over the long term. So by way of a brief conclusion, whilst progress is being made internationally and nationally on many of the concerns raised by BCH, more needs to be done to ensure the implementation and prioritisation of policies which respect and promote people's cultural heritage, rights and livelihoods in nature conservation contexts. The report highlights that this is particularly important as we think ahead to the likes of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will define priorities, targets and approaches for biodiversity conservation in the years to come. The interdependencies of biodiversity, cultural heritage and people's livelihoods and well-being need to be taken into account within an inclusive framework of participatory governance if the marginalisation of local communities is to be avoided and sustainable development made a reality. We must better recognise that the resilience of ecosystems is linked with the resilience of local communities, their cultural lives and their livelihoods. And greater support for culturally diverse practices, knowledges, values and forms of governance will benefit both people and biodiversity. So thank you very much for that, listening to the brief overview of what you can find in the report. You can download the full report at the link here, which has been posted in the chat. And I'm certainly happy to be contacted to answer any questions if we don't have time to cover them all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for that summary of the research, and there's a lot to unpack there, but as you say, people can dig into the report from that. But we've also got with us today, of course, a panel who will bring diverse points of view to that and help us kind of just explore some of these ideas a little bit from different points of view. Before we get into that discussion, I'd just like to offer some thoughts myself. I think there's a number of things came through in what you were saying there, which strike me as particularly important in the UK context, but indeed other contexts as well. One of the things that's brought in with the focus on cultural heritage here in relation to biodiversity is, as you say, it puts our focus very much on communities, community rights, and indeed collective rights and responsibilities beyond the individual. So cultural heritage brings us into that frame of mind of kind of thinking collectively, our rights and our responsibilities towards others as well. That seems to be quite an important point here about why the culture and cultural heritage component of this matters. The model you showed, of course, that just speaks to the need for integration. All of these parts are needed, or need to get due attention and care if we were to achieve the outcomes we want, both for nature, but for people, and it's bringing those things together, which is obviously key to this here as well. There's obviously a strong focus in this on empowerment. You mentioned the word self-determination, people having a say in decisions that affect them, having the ability also to not just have a say in decisions, but to act and to do things on the land and indeed in the sea, in the cases you've looked at, to take part in those landscapes and seascapes. The utility of the model in the UK context, I think, is certainly something we can explore as well. There's clearly a lot of links in what you're saying with existing things that are already happening in the UK, whether that's in the policy side, whether it's in practice on the ground. But what this does, this concept, this model, is to highlight those areas where there are shortcomings, where there are more attention needed, where things are not connecting properly, where things are not being addressed. As you say, so that idea of it being a sensitizing concept is perhaps one we can pick up on as what is this revealing to us when you look through this lens? What is it bringing into the foreground? And you've highlighted in that often the thing that it brings into the foreground is something that we know in many contexts is often not at the center of attention, which is this question of governance and who's involved in decisions, who's participating in all of these things. And then finally, that idea of the spectrum, that strikes me as that last diagram quite important, because there's a danger, of course, with these things of romanticizing or seeing traditional knowledge, cultural heritage of these things as something that's somehow of the past and to be preserved in some pristine state. Of course, that's not what you're saying. It's something that's dynamic, creative, it's rooted in communities and places, but nonetheless, it's a creative process. And I think we need to keep that at the fore of our minds as well. So enough from me. I'd like to go over to the panel now to hear from the panelists on their perspectives on this. What we've asked the panelists to do is, for 5 minutes or so each, is just to say from their perspective, what's the potential value of the Biocultural Heritage Framework in UK context. Then we'll have some time for discussion amongst the panel and indeed from questions from yourselves in the audience. So if you do have questions or comments you want to make to put into the discussion, please do use the chat to do that. If we could begin then with Hannah, if you're ready, Hannah Fluck, who is Head of Environmental Strategy at Historic England. Hannah's originally a Paleolithic archaeologist, so she takes a very long view of the relationship between people and the environment. After working as a heritage advisor in local government in England for over a decade, she joined Historic England in 2015, where she's worked on environmental strategy, in particularly climate change and heritage. She's a contributing author of the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment and a founding steering committee member of the Climate Heritage Network. So Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Zoe, for inviting me to be involved in this. I think it's an extraordinarily exciting piece of work from my point of view. As Chris said, I spend a lot of my time working in climate change and trying to convince people in the heritage sector that cultural heritage is relevant to tackling climate change, and vice versa to people in the cultural heritage sector that what they know is relevant to tackling the challenges of climate change. And a lot of that has centered around trying to break down these distinctions between culture and nature, which our policy framework and landscape in the UK is very wedded to. We have some quite clear distinctions and divisions sometimes between it's either natural or it's cultural. You can't have both, which as a Paleolithic archaeologist or as an archaeologist is nonsense. Our landscape and our environment is the result of thousands of years of human activity. And so I think this concept, and trying in particular to see how it relates to things that are familiar to that UK policy landscape and those very practical examples is going to be extraordinarily helpful in trying to illustrate why culture and nature are part and parcel of the same thing. I'm also particularly like that spectrum, the hierarchy, recognizing that actually it's not just about things that we have going on today. It's not just about the practices and the things that we can see and are still going on, but recognizing that we may have lost some things that are useful, and that's not a that doesn't mean that they're not part of this conversation about biocultural heritage and future sustainable ways of living. And as an archaeologist, that's music to my ears, because I spent a lot of time trying to persuade people that the sorts of knowledge and understanding that we have, particularly those long-term impacts and evidence of that complex interaction between people and places, is relevant to understanding how our behavior and our interaction with places will play out in the future. So I think that was something that particularly appealed to me. I like that idea. It can provide that lens and that continuity from the past to the present and into the future, but also recognizing the importance of change, that, as Chris said, it's not necessarily about putting traditional practices on a pedestal or trying to keep things the same. We are adapting to quite rapidly changing environmental conditions in a lot of places, and this will become more challenging as our climate changes. But actually embedding that biocultural understanding and approach, I think, can really help to empower people to feel engaged, to use knowledge and share knowledge to help us address those challenges in a sustainable way. So I think those are incredibly exciting aspects. I particularly liked, I think it's one of the final sentences in the report, the current system of values have not always been and need not always be. And I think that's an incredibly important sentiment for that critically thinking, what is it from these biocultural heritage practices and understanding that we want to take forward and that we need to. I use an analogy when I talk about climate change and heritage, a Lego analogy from the Lego movie. I borrowed it from Neil Redfern, who's the chairman of the Council for British Archaeology now, used to be a colleague at Historic England. And the Lego movie is based on the father figure is the baddie. He likes to fix everything. You build the Lego models and you stick them with glue and that's it, they're fixed. And that's how you want to protect things. And I think people often think of heritage as being fixing things. We try and keep things the same so we can pass them to the next generation as your pre-built, stuck together with glue Lego model. In actual fact, cultural heritage can be much more about understanding and learning from those processes of building those kits. I've got a couple of small children. My house is full of Lego. None of those models are from the kits. They're constantly reinventing, adapting to the games that they're playing. And this is about recognizing that knowledge is part of our building blocks for the future. How we can share that, how we can use that to adapt to novel situations is critically important. And I think the framework, as you've described it, really allows for that, recognizes how valuable those building blocks are in that biocultural heritage, but actually that they might not be passed to future generations as pristine, intact pieces of activity or knowledge or practices exactly as they have been, but will be adapting to these new challenges. And I think that's one of the most important and valuable aspects that I can see. So thank you. I'm going to stop rabbiting on about kids' films now and hand on to someone else.
Thank you, Hannah. That's really great. I'm sure we'll pick up on quite a number of things you said there. We'll carry on through the thoughts of the panel and then come back to some discussion maybe afterwards. If I could come to you next, Chris Higgins. Chris is a project manager at Eco Dovey. He's spent 25 plus years working in geographic information science, including 17 years leading research at the University of Edinburgh. Since semi-retiring, he's been undertaking work for Eco Dovey, an NGO delivering sustainable community regeneration in the Biosphere Reserve in Mid Wales there. His most recent completed project is one which Zoe's already mentioned as one of the case studies that features in the report, which is the Mixed Farming Histories and Futures project, which is very, very relevant, of course, to the things we're discussing here today. This project marshaled geographic information to advocate for an agroecological vision of sustainable agriculture in Wales. So Chris, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and inviting me along today. Yes, it was my privilege to be contacted by Zoe and invited to participate as a case study. The reason was the Mixed Farming Histories and Futures project. Mixed farming means livestock as well as arable. And where I live here in Mid Wales, as a comparative advantage in that it's very good for growing grass, and it's become like a sheep monoculture. But within living memory of the oldest people now, agriculture in this area used to be much more varied, much more diverse. So we used geographic information here to marshal information on what was grown in the past, what could be grown, what's being grown now, and what could be grown in the future, to try and advocate for a shift towards sustainable agriculture based on agroecological practices. Now, this is challenging. The farming community is very conservative, and in this area, it also happens to be the heartland of Welsh language, which is one of the oldest languages in in Europe, and the original British language. The Anglo-Saxons have pushed the Welsh speakers out to the West. But the heartlands within the farming community, and have managed to hang on to the language and the cultural identity, and it's core to that. So we didn't use biocultural heritage as a framework at all. We used agroecology. We were conscious right from the start that we were dealing with a project which did a very strong links between natural heritage and cultural heritage, and agroecology as a framework. It's a science, a set of practices, but it also essentially has a social aspect to it, and it advocates for local control, for farmers being in control, for traditional knowledge. It's very, very strong overlap with biocultural heritage. In our context, we collected oral histories from these elderly farmers, working with the National Library of Wales, which is one of the cultural crown jewels in Wales. And that was a brilliant way of reaching out to the farming community, not just the elderly farmers, but also the families. We also used maps from the 18th century showing that the landscape was completely different back then. It wasn't sheep everywhere. Would I used biocultural heritage in framing the project? Yes, I would have. I would have and I will do in the future. I see it as being complementary to agroecology, especially the strong overlap with the social aspect. I will use it in the future. I've got a couple of new projects starting off. One is a comparison with a biosphere reserve in the Urtabay, which is in the Basque country. So I'll use the framework for that particular project. I would say that it's complementary to agroecology, but there is a risk, and the risk is distracting from an almighty battle which is taking place at the moment. It's almost like the forces of evil are arraigned against agroecology at the moment. It's not popular with neoliberal economists. It's not popular with many governments in America and Brazil and in the UK. It's corporations like it, agro-industry likes it, the World Economic Forum doesn't like it. So be careful, be conscious of agroecology. It's popular in the global south. but it doesn't get as much traction here in developed countries as it should. And yeah, but a good piece of work, and I will use the kind of framework in the future.
Lovely, thanks, Chris. And again, just in what you're saying, that's just more examples of how this chimes this kind of idea with things already going on, and maybe there's some sort of benefit in kind of bringing these things together to amplify them. If we could move on now to you, Pete Rawcliffe, who's head of People and Places activity at Nature Scott. Pete has academic qualifications in the environmental and political sciences, and over 25 years experience for working for Nature Scott, which is the national nature agency here in Scotland, formerly known as Scottish Natural Heritage. As head of the People and Places team, Pete's responsible for the people-focused aspects of Nature Scott's remit, so how people experience, enjoy, understand, connect with, and care for Scotland's nature and landscapes. So Pete, over to you. Look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the invite. Thanks to Zoe for involving us in the work. And I think there's a really good opportunity for us to move forward collectively in finding the common ground that we're constantly striving to find. I guess some scene setting first and then some observations. As Chris has just said, Nature Scott used to be Scottish Natural Heritage. So we've changed our name in the last few months, in part because despite being in existence since 1991, the public in Scotland still saw us all about as the organisation, a well-run organisation, but an organisation nevertheless that looked after Scotland's castles rather than its nature. And I guess that's something to do with the word heritage in our previous title. But the name change is also about a signal of intent on our part. Like many environmental organisations, Nature Scott is increasingly focused on the linked challenges we face around climate change and biodiversity loss. And Hannah's usefully spoken about the degree of change that we've always lived with as humans, but also the rate of change speeding up that we're inheriting from the last 2 decades of climate and carbon use. To do this as an organisation, we're reframing what we do around 3 concepts: a concept of nature recovery, a concept around nature-based solutions for climate change, but also for health and well-being and for other societal problems, and the concept of natural capital, all of which we could spend a lot of time talking about today, but we haven't got that time. The challenges we face are both direct, pollution, habitat loss, but also systematic in how we as a society value and use nature. And we need to address both those challenges, the direct and the indirect challenges, if we are to make the changes required. And all of this needs us to involve and engage people and communities. So we need to connect people with nature, we need to co-design solutions with people, and we need to engage a wider range of stakeholders than our sector traditionally has in this effort. As you'll appreciate, none of this is easy for Nature Scott or others in the sector, and the behaviour change we are seeking in others also needs to be reflected in ourselves too. So within this context, the report is really exciting, and I'm keen to invite Zoe and possibly Chris to come and talk to Nature Scott colleagues about it, because it's a sort of discussion that we really want in the organisation at the moment. Some observations for me then about the report itself. I mean, from a landscape perspective, in one way, there's not really much new in here. It's the modus operandi is framed within the European Landscape Convention already, but it does helpfully link biodiversity, culture and heritage together in a UN framework, which I suspect organisations like Nature Scott may be able to get their heads around better than some of the things we've been dabbling with recently around cultural ecosystem services, which really hasn't got much penetration in our thinking. Making it relevant to the UK is really important, and I think the adaptive model in the report begins to do that. A good next step would be to join in the discussions taking place in the various boxes of the model and encourage those discussions, and making sure we involve a range of local and national perspectives in doing this. In discussing the report with Zoe, I noted that many of the complaints about the top-down scientific or even colonial behaviours of us nature conservationists could equally be levelled at historic and cultural organisations too. Indeed, there's something much wider here in the way we organise our society, which cuts across things like education and the health sectors as well. So the boxes which really interest me in here, in the model that Zoe's put together, is around local knowledge and participatory governance, because they seem key to be unlocking the healthy and resilient communities that we want to see. I do wonder about the language of all this. Biodiversity was never an easy word for us in our sector, and simply adding culture and heritage may make matters worse. The Finns are very good at constructing new language, but I'm not sure whether bioculture is something easy for us to grasp with and to communicate, and that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Heritage is also seen as backward looking. I know Hannah will kick me for saying this, but our experience of us being a castle management organisation certainly indicates that. So perhaps we need to be thinking about something more forward looking. And there is a lot of parallels to the work and thinking about place and place-based approaches here, which ties in well with this concept. And finally, something else I discussed with Zoe about, what's the equivalent of Peruvian potatoes for Scotland or the rest of the UK? And I think Chris has illustrated that quite nicely. There are some stuff in there. Obviously, rare breeds might be another good example. And it's certainly interesting to note that increased relevance of these to conservation practice on nature reserves at the moment. So there's a lot of common ground here I think we can build on, but I will stop there.
Great, thanks, Pete. There's certainly, again, a number of things that we'll come back to there, I'm sure. But if I can just come over to you, Christina. So Christina Swiderska is a principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And as Zoe explained in our presentation, the IIED's work in relation to biocultural heritage was the inspiration behind this research as well. Christina has 26 years experience of conducting action research on sustainable development in developing countries, with a particular focus on biodiversity, traditional knowledge, and agri-food systems. She leads on IIED's biocultural heritage work and has been conducting research on this since 2005, when she co-developed the concept with Indigenous peoples. As I say, it's that work that inspired the research we're here to talk about today, so we're very glad to have you with us, Christina. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to your panel and to speak at this important event. And congratulations to Zoe Russell and Inherit on the great report. I think this whole initiative is a rare example of a southern conservation concept being considered in a northern context. Usually it's the other way around. So I really appreciate this work, and before addressing the question of what is the potential value of applying the biocultural heritage framework in the UK, I'd like to give a little bit of background on the concept of biocultural heritage. So as Zoe presented, the original definition that was developed by IIED and Asociación Andes in 2005. We were at a workshop in Peru, and we also had partners from Panama, Kenya, India, and China. So we all needed a common conceptual framework for research on traditional knowledge and biodiversity. And the concept of biocultural heritage provided that common framework. But it really comes from the work of Asociación Andes, which is an indigenous NGO. And it works very closely with Quechua people in the Andes in the potato park. And particularly the thought leader behind it, I must recognize, is Alejandro Argumedo, an indigenous thinker and activist from Peru. So we defined collective biocultural heritage as having the 5 key elements that Zoe presented: traditional knowledge, biodiversity, landscapes, cultural and spiritual values, and customary laws of indigenous peoples and local communities that are all inextricably linked and interdependent. And this concept very much reflects the holistic worldview of indigenous peoples. and it seeks to assert their rights over their biodiversity as their heritage in response to lack of recognition of these rights by the Biodiversity Convention and government policies. So having developed this concept at the workshop, we then conducted research with 11 different indigenous groups in 5 countries. And this research really validated the 5 key components. And we concluded that biocultural heritage is very much a complex system with multiple interlinkages and interdependencies between the components. And we also concluded that language is a key component, which actually we missed, that we should really include in this framework. We found through our work over the last 16 years that the framework is really useful for strengthening community biodiversity stewardship, for example, by establishing biocultural heritage territories, and also for strengthening local economies based on biocultural heritage, biocultural products and services such as tourism. It's also a very useful framework for research on traditional knowledge because it's holistic, so it allows you to look at the different drivers of change affecting traditional knowledge. And we found that in a policy context, it's very useful for highlighting the need to bridge sectoral silos. I mean, still cultural heritage and biodiversity are still sort of very much dealt separately, as others have already said. And for communities, indigenous communities, that just doesn't make any sense at all. So coming back to the question, what is the potential of applying the framework in the UK context? I think in any context, the framework, the value of the framework is in connecting conservation to local peoples' heritage, history, identity, values, knowledge, and rights. It's really about handing over control of conservation, handing over rights and responsibilities to local communities, promoting collective self-governance by communities. And in this way, it aims to generate strong social and cultural incentives for conservation, as well as economic incentives for strong local ownership and sustainability. And often this reduces enforcement costs. So the framework, as I said, has proved really valuable in developing countries for addressing multiple biodiversity and development goals. And at the heart of the framework, I'd really like to emphasize is this spiritual or religious dimension, that biodiversity to indigenous peoples is not just a resource. In fact, it's more about a sacred, a religious element. All biodiversity, rocks, all elements in landscapes have spirits. And I think it's really this sacred dimension, which is humanity's deepest bond with nature. And in an indigenous context, that's where the customary laws and the governance principles come from. It's from the spiritual and the sacred dimension. So is that applicable in the UK today? Well, obviously the UK is very different. There are no or few indigenous peoples as such, seeking self-determination and land rights. And I think it's important to recognize that it may be, the spiritual dimension may be applicable in parts of the UK, in areas, maybe in Scotland with remnants of Gaelic spiritual beliefs, and also with traditional production systems. But I think it's important to recognize that the framework is not just about protecting heritage that exists today. It's also about reviving heritage and understanding heritage. And I think when we look at our indigenous past, at our Celtic and Gaelic biocultural heritage, it's really not very different to that of indigenous peoples in other countries. And I think it's really very useful to keep that spiritual dimension in mind, even in a UK context, because that is, for local communities, that adds meaning. If their landscape used to be a sacred burial ground, or this deep historical connection to a landscape will add meaning for local communities today and strengthen stewardship today. And also the knowledge about this heritage and the spiritual value can also provide important stories for tourism, obviously, and linked to economic value. So I think the framework, the original biocultural heritage framework, needs to be adapted to the UK context. But I think that the framework used in the report is great in doing that, but it has slightly lost the emphasis on heritage. So personally, I think it would be worthwhile expanding it a bit and keeping it broad, because there's so many different contexts in the UK. So rather than just talking about local knowledge, making it explicit local and traditional knowledge, so that element isn't lost. And similarly, not just social and economic values, but also including spiritual values explicitly, and as well as participatory governance, mentioning customary laws. So I think it would be a shame to lose those elements. I would say the issue in the UK is obviously the framework has to be applied differently. That would be the main difference, is how it's applied. You can't necessarily revive spiritual values, but you can make those known. So yeah, I think just to finish, what's also important is to look at each local context individually and allow local communities to define what is biocultural heritage for themselves, but using the historical knowledge to inform that. And that way, that's the most useful way, I think, for the framework to promote collective self-governance. And there are, in Indigenous cultures, there are concepts similar to biocultural heritage that emphasize balance between the natural, human and spiritual worlds. And I'm sure that's the same in Gaelic or other Indigenous cultures in the UK. So I think this heritage, it's not fully alive today, but we have historical records, and it needs to be more widely known to fully recognise and strengthen our relationship with nature here in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and obviously very valuable for us all to hear your perspective, given your involvement in and experience of the development of these kind of ideas and application of them outside of the UK, and then sort of looking in then on this context from the other side. Okay, there's so much to pick on here. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and there's quite a few points, I think, of connection coming through what the panel, different panel members are saying. So I'd like to just kick off by maybe just trying to drill into some of these things, but please do keep on putting comments and questions in the chat, and I'll try and pick up on as much as I can with the time we have left, which is a little over half an hour. I think just building off the back of what you were saying there, Christina, I think it might be really useful to ground this a little bit more in the UK context by thinking about examples, like particular places, particular contexts or circumstances where this might have some resonance, this biocultural heritage idea. And we've heard already from you, Chris, today about the context of farming in mid Wales and the farming communities there, and you brought up the question of language and so on, and mixed farming as part of that heritage. That I think is quite an important one, because there might be a tendency to see this as something which only applies to a very small minority of people in the UK who somehow live a traditional life. But when we start to talk about traditions and connections with land and so on, of course, we can bring that discussion into a farming context and see where that leads us. Zoe, I'm also conscious in the report you bring up quite a number of examples here with crofting communities in Scotland, with commons in England and Wales, some of which go back hundreds of years in terms of the way they're governed and managed, fishing contexts as well, and many others. And perhaps some of the points you're making, Christina, link with some of these concepts that are embedded in the languages we have here. And again, Zoe, in the report you mentioned concepts like duchas in Scottish Gaelic, which expresses, I suppose, a sense of belonging and other things to particular places. It's not quite spiritual, but it's a cultural rather than economic, let's say, or idea. And I think there's an equivalent in Welsh as well, if I'm right, Chris, which I won't try and pronounce, so you can maybe tell us about. So anyway, rather long way of leading up to what I'd like to ask everyone on the panel, and maybe beginning with you, Zoe, if I could, is just, can you give some examples, some concrete examples of where you think this biocultural heritage exists today and it's alive within the UK? And we can get on to the lost and the past things maybe later on. But Zoe.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, I think you probably picked up on what I would say would be, for me, the kind of key kind of area is when we think about Gaelic concepts like Dúchas, because in the report, in case study 4, it's about marine conservation and heritage. And so there, Dúchas, it doesn't just apply to people's relationship with land, but also the sea. It's very much part of this idea that Christina talks about. It's part of a worldview, a mindset that people have. And I do certainly think that that still exists in many places across the UK. I think that, like Christina said, that the problem is that this is not well known about in many contexts. And I think someone in the chat comments has kind of given a comment that I would agree with about how, you know, we're dominated by particular ways of thinking about things now, which tend to be unspiritual. They tend to, or, you know, they're based on ideas of economic value and other kinds of values. I do see creeping in more and more around sort of well-being, and in the policy, one of the ways I was trying to kind of translate that idea of spirituality was around well-being, and the way that it's discussed about, there's just something about that engagement with nature that gives you as a human some sort of feeling of connection. It's something bigger than you, and I think that could be an interesting way to talk about spirituality more broadly, so that we don't lose that aspect of biocultural heritage. But I certainly think that the Gaelic is a really underexplored area. I know there's people in the audience that are kind of working on this kinds of stuff as well, and I'm sure they would agree that it's tragic that a lot of this knowledge is being lost today, and the language itself. Sorry, that was long. I'll stop.
No, great, thank you. And I wonder if I can come to you, Pete, at this point, because I'm conscious that Nature Scott has been taking interest in language and things like place names and how they sort of embed knowledge about the landscape, but also, of course, through Nature Scott and previously SNH's work, I mean, you have collaborated with Croft of Smallholders, others, you know, obviously. So whether there's particular examples you'd like to draw out is where this might have some relevance. And
thanks, Chris. Yeah, I don't think I've got much to add to the emphasis on, I guess, traditional farming practices, but in the context of that spectrum. So taking the bits which are relevant forward into the future, I think is a really important thing to grapple. And I guess that's where a lot of the demonstration and the partnership work that Nature Scott's been involved in the north and west of Scotland has focused on. I guess the thing I was going to say, just to put a bit of an urban feel on it, I was wondering about allotments and the practice of growing your own food. It seems to be a rich area for thinking about biocultural heritage in the UK, partly because it is a growing thing at the moment, but also because it's seen as relevant to people. And I guess the danger of focusing in on remote rural areas is that actually the relevance of this agenda across society as a whole is potentially lost. So I think it would be really good to encourage thinking about this in the urban realm as well as the rural realm here. But allotments is my best guess at it. Coppicing, I see, was in the chat from Hannah. That was good. That's how we manage woodland is going to be a really important area. We need lots more woodland in Scotland and the rest of the UK. Is that going to be an industrial process? I would hope not. So actually thinking about how we coppice and manage woodlands now moving forward is going to be really important. And I guess there's a really strong link here to skills and employment. We're thinking quite hard about nature-based skills at the moment in respect to climate change. And actually, for some of the practices that we need, we're going to have to regrow. So forestry and farming and fishing practices are all going to have to evolve quite dramatically. So we need to think about skills and training around those things moving forward. So I think those agendas all move this concept into the here and now and into the future, which I think is part of that spectrum concept that Zoe's nailed in this report.
Thanks, Pete. And I'm just, your urban example there, I think you're quite right on that. We need to be considering all the many different contexts this applies in. And I think, Zoe, that was behind the thinking of the front cover image on the report, which is from Edinburgh. It's in a very urban context there, to just communicate that point that this could apply everywhere, and does actually when you start to think about it in different ways. Hannah, could I come to you just to, I think, Pete, you've raised there some issues around how to take this further and how it might be applied in different ways, and the kinds of conversations that start to need to happen to make use of this. I'd certainly like to come back to that, but if I can come to you, Hannah, first, just to pick up on this idea of kind of examples and helping us to ground it. I mean, I think from the English context, from the work of Historic England, or outside of that, if there's anything particular which comes to mind as a way of kind of expressing what this might mean on the ground. Yeah,
I think one of the things that sort of struck me actually about the report was, although there's mention of designated areas and places, actually there isn't much talk about designation. And I think that's really important, because actually we often dominate conversations with the most precious, recognised, scheduled monuments, listed buildings, registered parks and gardens, areas of outstanding natural beauty. But actually what's really critical for me is that relationship between people and their local places. And I also was thinking, as this report was written during COVID lockdown, was it 3? Who knows? But the depths of that time where we were all trapped in a local area, having a lot of us rethinking that relationship with those places. And I think some of that spirituality that we've been talking about, does that come through as you relearn or rediscover places where you might just have gone to walk the dog every day because you had to, and then when you've got nowhere else to go, do you start to look at that differently? You recognise the way in which the fields are set out, the woodland, the lumps and bumps in the woodland, the plants that are growing in the different seasons, and I think that connection at that very local level is something that I really would like to see a lot more of, and I think it probably speaks to a lot more people. You'd be hard pressed to find any aspect of our biodiversity that doesn't rely on something that people used to do or still do, and therefore understanding the remnants. So I live in Hampshire, a quite heavily farmed area, but I know the fields that I walk daily have been fields farmed as fields since the Iron Age, and that continuity gives me a great source of pleasure, that kind of feeling of looking out over a landscape where you can imagine the wisps of smoke and that sense of continuity. But I also know that some of the plants and animals that we find, particularly some of the botanical interest, is indicative of remnants of that land use over many centuries. And I think it's that very local and the very that often gets forgotten, particularly if we're talking about policy. And I don't know how we help to find that place, but those are the sorts of examples I'm thinking of. I live in an area with lots of coppicing, which is why that always springs to mind, because that's very characteristic of my landscape.
Great, thanks, Hannah. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of comments that have just come through the chat here, which again just help expand the kind of the scope of all this. I mean, so just from Eddie Stiven, I'm particularly keen to see more work to be done to protect the inshore fisheries in West of Ross, and perhaps even to revive lost fisheries like the inshore herring fishery and many and diverse cultural and historical influences which sustain that. So this idea of fisheries, and again, Zoe, you look at this in the report, the fishing and how fishing has changed, and particularly these inshore fisheries is something a context to look at, and that's why you got into seascapes as well as landscapes here. And the comment from Corinne Angier, might there be language and memories of very different ways of living off the land within some traveller communities, and maybe not just memories, but current relationships with the land as well. So again, when you've got a mobile communities, mobile people, that brings another dimension to this as well. So I think when you start to unpack this was my experience in talking to Zoe who's doing the work, is that actually you start to become aware of, sensitized to many different examples of this within the UK. It's not necessarily a dead and gone thing. We're not used to maybe thinking about these things in quite the same way. If I can take us on to move us on to just another question that's come up, which is around the importance of this idea of the word heritage in this. I mean, Christina, you raised this about something you felt had been lost in translation to an extent in the work. So it's clearly critical to the original concept or original way of thinking about this. This is heritage. You express that. I think, Hannah, you made some comments around kind of the past in this context. Well, their heritage is more than just the past, of course. Zoe, I wonder if I can come to you first to maybe just respond to that and say, well, from your point of view, why does it matter that this is referred to as biocultural heritage, and begin us off on that?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. In my kind of PhD research, part of it is from a sort of critical heritage studies perspective, and within that, you know, heritage is not considered to be kind of past orientated. You know, its heritage is inherently future orientated, and within this, you know, we think about heritage more as a kind of social process. It's about how we relate to the past and the present for the future. And so that kind of way of thinking about heritage was always in the kind of back of my mind, and to me seems to be part of what biocultural heritage invokes as well. And I think certainly in the kind of academic context, a lot of the discussion about heritage is also that linkage of heritage with sustainability. And so really infusing within heritage this kind of broader concern about, I think somebody mentioned it earlier about, you know, what are the kind of values underpinning our societies and that we're taking forward into the future. We need to be more conscious of that. What are those values and practices and things that we're bringing forward? And I think biocultural heritage really helps you do that, but only with the retention of the heritage focus.
Yeah, I think in the report from rightly you refer to, is it the Faro Convention definition of heritage, but that carrying forward idea, and it's almost a collective act or decision to carry forward, which is as important as anything else here. I wonder, Chris, can I come to you again about this, just to go back to the context of the mixed farming histories and futures project? I mean, you said a lot about agroecology, but so I'm wondering, I mean, it's a project that has in the title this histories, and you referred to that. What difference did it make to ground the discussion around mixed farming in heritage and histories, rather than to simply have it as a discussion about agroecology, for example?
It makes a kind of a huge difference. It's in terms of kind of, I mean, I believe this stuff is critically urgent at the moment. There's just that IPCC report a couple of weeks ago, Code Red for Humanity. It's how do we get a shift? What are the transition pathways towards a sustainable, ecologically sustainable society? What are those agroecological transition pathways? And cultural heritage has been neglected, and it's not as well understood as it should be. And I think by engaging in kind of collecting oral histories, we communicated with a broad demographic within the kind of farming community. It helped them understand what we were trying to do. And yeah, so it's vital.
Great, thanks, Chris. Christina, can I come back to you as well? I mean, I guess one of the key points here is that when you focus heavily on the cultural heritage aspect of this, or keeping the heritage dimension in the forefront, I mean, that must link with the other things you emphasized around rights and empowerment, because that heritage in this case is really often within people, and therefore the people have to have a central role in everything. So is that one of the key things to bring out here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in the UK, the context, so much heritage has been lost. So although heritage is about the future as people and the present, in the UK, there has to be a really strong focus on the past as well when we're talking about biocultural heritage, because a lot of the stories and values are not commonly known. They're just documented in journal historical articles or whatever. And there's a real job to be done to revive that, bring it out, make it publicly known, and to local communities, stewards, but also to the wider public that enjoy these important natural spaces. And I think, you know, these sort of values and this history is a really important link to rights and empowerment, because it motivates people, it generates ownership, it generates pride in their local environment, it generates meaning. So the two go together. Does that make sense?
That's to me. I can see Hannah nodding as well. Actually, Hannah, I wanted to come to you next. I think just to pick up again on some of the comments. One of the comments actually that jumped out at me was from Robbie Scarf. Firstly, congratulates you on the report. And says the biocultural heritage framework clearly has very many strengths and possible positive uses. For things to improve, though, it's always good to identify and improve upon weaknesses. So he says, I'd be interested to hear Zoe and the panelists' thoughts on any aspects of the framework which they think perhaps needs further work or improvement. And I just wanted to link from that, if I can come to you, Hannah, first, just to begin talking about how to take something like this forward. So what, and again, a number of you already referred to this in what you've said, what to do this, what conversations need to happen. I think particularly, I mean, if I could just segue that from this discussion then again about rights and empowerment. I'm conscious I'm sitting in Scotland, but that's a very live discussion. We have a lot of discussion around land reform, community empowerment, these kind of things. The English context, you have equivalents with a very different flavour, I think, as well. So, sorry, rather roundabout way of just putting this to you is, how do we begin to take some of these things forward, and what needs to be discussed further, adapted, even looked at and changed within what Zoe's been saying through the research here in the context that you work in?
Yeah, I think it's the very interesting connections with some of the work that the Climate Heritage Network that I've been involved with is involved with. That's an international organisation that brings together arts, culture and heritage organisations for climate action. But there's a lot of work through Indigenous people, local community groups around the world looking at how you can support and give a platform for local voices and traditional knowledge. So a lot of what Christina's been saying really resonates with what I know colleagues working in those areas have been experiencing. And in an English context, I've been thinking about what that really means for us. And I think a lot of the challenges are very similar, even though at first glance they might not be. It's about the language that we use, what we think of as evidence, as information, the way in which that's conveyed and communicated to decision makers, and the hierarchy of decision makers. And that often means that local knowledge and what we're talking about here, the understanding of places and practices, is really hard to communicate to those people who want dots on maps, lines on maps, scientific publications and evidence in a particular, they've got a particular idea as to what information and evidence looks like. And we have to really find ways to help people understand that what someone whose family have been engaged in farming an area for generations knows and understands about that land and that place, and how that might be relevant to decision making. What would it take for people to be able to listen to and understand and engage with the sorts of information and knowledge that they have? And it needs to be quite practical, and it also needs to be accessible. And it's I think it's a huge challenge, but I think we can probably learn a lot from some of the work that's going on with some of the communities that Christina was talking about. That I really like the idea that the Global South has got a hell of a lot to teach us about how we can relearn some of those connections. I also think there's some really things that bother me and keep me awake at night around the kind of perpetual division between nature and culture in some of the approaches, but also in some quite the conversations that we have around wilding and nature and allowing nature to giving places back to nature. All these sorts of conversations are very popular at the moment, and they resonate with people. And one of the things that I've noticed is that it may be that is almost absolving us of that responsibility, that really close connection that people and the world around us have, that we've become disconnected from, perhaps. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I don't think we can absolve ourselves of responsibility for the state of the world. And I think there's something about biocultural heritage that you can start to reconnect people. But I think it has to be through less traditional means, not through scientific reports, but perhaps through stories and more human ways of communicating. And I think the arts come into that hugely. I know there's a lot of work around that, but I think we really need to explore how we can work with different ways of sharing that understanding and communication. It will be uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of people, but I think that's probably the only way we can do that.
Thanks. Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, that nature-culture divide in our policies, the way we think, and I suppose in many of our lives is one of the key ways in which we're disempowered from being involved, and it's also the root of many of our problems, of course. There's something coming through what you're saying, and then Christina, I was very struck by when you were speaking initially. I mean, you were using phrases like hand over rights and responsibilities to communities, and then you talked about strong local ownership. And I think this is one of the values of looking outside of our own context here to what's going elsewhere, is that these very strong messages are what comes back, and that forces these kind of conversations, I think, here, which is one of the great benefits of having these kind of comings together. Now that's, I mean, handing over rights and responsibilities to communities is a very difficult problem, I suppose, to deal with in a policy kind of context, but nonetheless, it's something that's very significant, that's also very live. Pete, if I could come to you here, I mean, I'm just conscious in the Scottish context that this is very much on the agenda. So from a Nature Scot point of view, I don't if there's anything you might want to say around that as to community empowerment in these kind of contexts, and how this concept, this idea, this discussion, how that might intersect with that.
That's a big question at the end of the session, Chris. That's the way we want to go. Getting there is really difficult for a whole range of reasons. But the international, national policies that we inherit, the approaches that we work with, the capacity of communities to engage and to sustain that engagement are all really difficult. But yeah, I thought you were going to ask me about rewilding, so perhaps that's an easier question to answer.
Start there if you like.
No, well, no and yes. I was going to just pick up your question. I'm not just trying to dodge the question, Chris. I just think that's a really big separate discussion, and there's things we've done well and there's things we've done less well over the course of many years. So it's how we learn as an organisation around some of that. I guess it also fits into a wider discussion here. And again, the focus is on nature conservation possibly, but actually this is about how local communities are empowered and encouraged to get involved in all aspects of their lives, and not just the land or the landscape, but also their health and well-being and their education as well. So I think there's a bigger question in here that until we get that sort of local governance in the UK discussion concluded, I think any national organisation is going to struggle to engage with local communities from time to time. But one thing I was going to pick up was sort of Hannah's thread about tools and techniques, and we have tried some of this stuff before, but it's never quite landed. And I guess, is that because the timing wasn't quite right, or because of the way we did it on a sectoral basis? But I'm thinking about things like we tried Placebook Scotland, which was a sort of Facebook ripoff, which was focused about getting communities and individuals to talk about their relationships to place, whether it be the nature of that place or the artistic and historic associations of that place or the communities of that place. So that disappeared as the technology moved on. But I wonder whether new technology here has a role to actually untapping some of that rich heritage that we still have, and having that live dialogue in a way that traditional ways we monitor and survey things miss. And the other one was about, and I'm sure this is replicated across the UK, talking about your place toolkit, which we did with Historic Environment Scotland, was just trying to get communities to talk about these things more, and to think about the values and benefits that they deride from their local place. So there are toolkits out there, and I guess the question for me as a sort of national person is, how can we get those tools to the right places and being used in the right way? And perhaps there's things I mentioned here about co-design and co-designing and engaging with more stakeholders than we normally do are really important issues, I think, for us here. And I guess the last point, just building on those two, would be that there is a window of opportunity here. Yeah, Code Red for humanity. There's lots of Code Reds for humanity, but this is quite an important new one. And the scale of change we're talking about, if you read the reports from various committees, we're talking about land use change of about 30% by 2050. So we're talking about significant changes in the way that we relate to land and landscape being required of us to make these changes. So it's a really live issue. And this concept, I think, is really one of the key ways we try and move forward on this issue. So I welcome continuing the discussion moving forward. It's one of the tools in the toolkit, and I think we need to develop it and use it more.
Thanks, Pete. I mean, I think that usefully raises, I mean, there's a number of different ways we need to think about taking this forward. One is how best to identify, recognize, draw out the kind of the heritages that are there, whether it's knowledge, values, practices, whether those are lost or whether those are alive and well, but just not recognized by decision makers and so on, or anywhere in between. That's one thing. The second thing, which comes through very strongly, and I think Zoe and what you've been writing, is the key part of this is sustaining. It's actually how the people who hold that heritage sustain themselves as communities. So it's not so much about the heritage in the first instance, it's about what support and what recognition and so on do people have in order to sustain themselves and their knowledge and ways of living and so on. And the third thing then that came out in the discussion there was around governance, how decisions are made and how they're taken and so on. And Hannah, I saw you put in the chat there about we need to consider the different mechanisms in different parts of the UK there for engagement and governance, community planning, neighbourhood plans, parish plans you referred to. Elsewhere in the chat, community woodlands was mentioned, and that brings up land ownership, obviously a key. If a community owns the land in this country, then you naturally have a very strong stake in the decisions that are made, different from if you're a community that doesn't own the land. So all of these things come into the governance equations. As you say, Pete, that's a broad discussion to be had there. I'm conscious of the time. I wanted to come back to you, Zoe, to give you the last word before I close. And I don't know, I mean, I'll leave it to you to decide what you want to say, because I don't want to put you on the spot, but really the thought that was in my head was, well, what would you like to see in terms of this being taken forward? Is there anything particular you want to highlight as being something that struck you as particularly important or strongly from this, or that you'd like to see happen?
I think, firstly, I just think biocultural heritage is so relevant to so many different things, and it was so hard to only have 3 months to work on this, and when I felt like it was a kind of each thing unpacks another thing, you know, and I felt like I could have probably worked on this for years and years. So I really hope people pick this up, you know, and run with it, and I would love to see this being applied in practical contexts, picked up by other researchers, used in policy contexts. But I also just think maybe the one thing that hasn't necessarily been mentioned that I would just say is that I do ultimately think that a lot of this, in terms of taking it forward, is about questions of power, which we haven't necessarily talked about explicitly, but it's been there in the discussion about who has the power to shape the future. And I think ultimately, you know, these are questions that have been maybe skirted around for a bit too long. And I personally think that something like biocultural heritage can help to really reinforce that power shift needs to go back to the people at that level of, you know, community level, and that it's not just about sort of shifting the burden onto communities, but it's about that fundamental restructure in terms of being enabled to have a resilient livelihood, which I think is not the case currently.
Thank you, Zoe. I think that's a great note to end on. I mean, you described it as a sensitizing content at the beginning, and what you're saying it sensitizes to here is that the absence of the question of power and the discussions that we tend to have around these things, at least here. So thank you for that. I think we'll close there. That's been wonderful. Thank you very much. I'd just like to end by thanking you, Zoe, in the first place for doing this, for suggesting it, for doing it, for producing such a great report, and then for presenting it to us today. Can I also thank Christina, Hannah, Chris and Pete for taking part in the discussion. It's been great to have you, and that's really helped us begin to flesh out what is something we could only really scratch the surface of here, of course. Can I thank again the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science for providing the funding to support Zoe. And then thank you to everyone who's attended today and submitted comments and questions or just come along to listen. As I say, the event's being recorded. It will be made available on our website. We'll post on social media about that. And the report's there for you to read. So thank you very much.